Then some of the scribes and the Pharisees said to Jesus, "We wish to see a sign from you." But Jesus answered, "An evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it, except that of the prophet Jonah. Just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so for 3 days and 3 nights will the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth." The people of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the proclamation of Jonah. And see, something greater than Jonah is here. And yes, the Queen of the South will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because she came from the ends of the earth to listen to the wisdom of Solomon. And see, something greater than Solomon is here.
When I searched online for the reasons why whales decline and die, I saw that the top-ranking results were neither unfathomable in the way of starfields nor motivated by barbarous intent per whaling fleets. Nothing extraordinary was returned, nothing covert. Instead, I found myself scrolling through a list of quotidian conveniences, overlooked residues and debris, a spill of lowly, forgotten things, sundry as junk mail. That was how I first learnt about the sperm whale, washed up dead on the Spanish coastline with a greenhouse, an entire greenhouse in its belly. The flattened greenhouse from a hydroponics business in Almeria enclosed tarps, hose pipes and ropes, flower pots, a spray canister, and bits of synthetic burlap. It had once sheltered off-season tomatoes grown for export in Britain. High winds likely collapsed the structure, bundling it from dry into the ocean. Flash flooding and storms of eerie, unexpected power were gaining in the region known as the salad bowl of Europe. An inventory of the animal's gut itemised other indistinguishable objects too. Alarmingly, goods of comfort and leisure. In addition to the greenhouse, the sperm whale had swallowed parts of a mattress, a coat hanger, a dishwasher plastic pot, and an ice cream container. Like a chamber furnished for a prophet or a castaway, these stomach contents recalled stories of people surviving inside the whales, I thought. Old parables anyone can tell, in which such traces are taken for proof of life. Here, though, the midden account amounted to a cause of death. Domestic products were newly dangerous. Seen from this angle, the banality of household items belied their potential for a gruesome afterlife. Abandoned fishing gear, drift nets, long lines, fish traps and oyster racks had long been identified as hazards for sea creatures. But whoever guessed that whales could or would eat bits of bedding and kitchenware?
the first tearing of the heart of our planet. How do we handle suffering and death, and what has God to do with them? These are the questions at the heart of Good Friday, and they apply at all levels of life, including the ecological. For ecological suffering and death, as we have just heard, are very real, and they also raise significant theological issues. These days, for example, I hear people use expressions such as trust the universe or trust Mother Earth. They're usually intended either to express their own faith in something more than ourselves or to encourage others. As such, where traditional religions fail to communicate, I guess they can be euphemisms for God. They are something to help humanity on its way, especially when we face suffering and death, and when we seek hope beyond the human hopes, which are so frequently or seemingly utterly crushed. The problem is that trusting in something other than God doesn't tend to work much better than other perceived traditional ideas. For I don't know about you, but it is pretty hard to trust Mother Earth, for example, when she or it is full of such threats. As we've just heard, pollution by plastics and other things is everywhere. Even in the so-called developed world, we often cannot literally entirely trust the water we drink. As COVID-19, above all, has taught us, we also certainly cannot always trust the air we breathe. And we could add the threats of fire, flood, nuclear, and other potential ecological concerns. So no wonder there is so much existential angst on our planet and in ourselves. Now, much ecological suffering is, of course, directly due to human agency, and for this we begin by repenting today. Yet can the glorious but flawed planet or universe really help us ultimately? For don't these remain created things, subject to decline and decay, and without ultimate existence in themselves? And so we are thrown back on God, particularly because the suffering of the wider creation itself struggles for redemption. So how do you feel about whales, the sea creatures we've just heard mentioned? Whales, it has to be said, have an uncertain, even sometimes a bad reputation in both biblical and wider Christian traditions. And it's not surprising. Before modern times, whales were viewed as powerful and often very scary creatures. And much is due to interpretations of the great story of Jonah and a lack of awareness. For sometimes Christian art would picture whales with large fangs, elephant-like trunks, or even horns, especially when Jonah's whale was seen to represent the gates of hell or the devil. Yet, like other aspects of the more than human creation, they also point us towards God. For the whale, and that is the point of our reading today, the whale symbolizes the process of finding new life through the transformation of suffering as we experience it on all levels, including the ecological. So no wonder Jesus, in the gospel reading we just heard, and later Christians picked it up, because Jonah's story, though it is a fanciful story, is a type for Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, which itself is a symbol for all our lives, including that of sea creatures, the planet, the universe, and everything else. So we need to attend to the whales, not least to our experience of living in the whale. For whales, like other sea creatures, typically lay before us choices between life and death, and the challenges of greater awareness and endurance to find hope again. Now, just up the coast, the Darkin young people know this well. You can see the whale as a totemic symbol and a source of practical life on so many of their rock engravings on the Central Coast. They knew how to live in relationship with sea and other creatures, and not simply to plunder and destroy. For they knew that what we do to the whales and to other sea creatures, we do to ourselves and to God, the Spirit of life itself. And so as we come in lament and penitence today, may we trust in God who is crucified in the whales and the other creatures beyond humanity, and into whose depths we are plunged, so that, like the whales, we may surface again and swim more gloriously with all the torn heart of creation. Amen.
Pilate then called together the chief priests and leaders and the people, and he said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people. And here I've examined him in your presence and not found this man guilty of any of the charges that you have brought against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he's done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." But they shouted, "Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us." This was a man who was put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why, what evil have they done? I found in them no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have them flogged and release them." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that Jesus should be crucified. And their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they wished.
Resistance. It's war again. A family carries its family out of a pranged house under a burning thatch. The next scene smacks of archive newsreel, platforms and trains. Never again, never again. Toddlers passed over heads and shoulders, lifetimes stowed in luggage racks. It's war again. Unmistakable smoke on the near horizon, mistaken for thick fog. Fingers crossed. An old blue tractor tows an armoured tank into no man's land. It's the ceasefire hour. Godspeed the columns of winter coats and fur-lined hoods, the high wire walk over buckled bridges managing cases and bags, balancing east and west. Godspeed. It's war again. The woman in black gives sunflower seeds to the soldier, insists his marrow will nourish the national flower. In dreams, let bullets be birds. Let cluster bombs burst into flocks. False news is news with the pity edited out. It's war again. An air raid siren can't fully mute the cathedral bells. Let's call that hope.
the second tearing of the heart, our world. Like so many of us, my heart is torn by war. We all have our particular concerns and memories in this, for it's hardly just Ukraine, is it? Yemen, Myanmar, Syria, Sudan, the list goes on. According to the United Nations, 2 billion people, or a quarter of the world's population, now lives in conflict-affected areas. An estimated 84 million people were forcibly displaced because of conflict, violence and human rights violations, and an estimated 274 million people will need humanitarian assistance due to conflict. The UN Secretary-General says the world is experiencing the highest number of violent conflicts since 1945, when World War II drew to a close. So what, during a federal general election on this Good Friday, are we gathering about? Who do we choose? Jesus or Barabbas? And I'm not simplifying that in party political terms. What truly matters to us? Will we choose to dwell on death and death dealing, or will we tuck them away separately? Is our future to be one of more death and mourning, or choosing paths of life? When will we as nations and as species choose Christ, the Prince of Peace, and all our parties choose that, over Barabbas? What kind of leadership will bring us peace? Do we seek true makers of peace, or will we settle for our own pilots? Which treaties do we really need to establish? In what kinds of weapons will we put our trust? Today, each of us in our global community is implicated in the sin of war, not just through our media, but through the structures of power, the economy, and the choices we ourselves make. So let us acknowledge the things which make for war today and seek Christ's peace. For like a sunflower seed falling into the ground, in this there is also hope.
As they led Jesus away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of people followed, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?"
Black deaths in custody. Despite the cost, a new jail has been built. It seems the incarceration rates are trebling. I only came here in the role of deaths in custody inspector. All the cells are stark and spotless. Blank screens watch from the corner. The officers have the highest technology. The faces of the staff still look the same. When I walk down this wing and peer into this filthy room, the door closes behind me. The feeling in my heart is changing from a proud strength of duty to fear. All the stories I have heard stand silent in the space beside me. A coil of rope is being pushed under the door of this cell.
The third tearing of the heart of our nation. What does the word atonement, at-one-ment, mean to you? Making one or making whole is another way of putting it. Sadly, a devastating aspect of some recent Christian faith is the insistence by some that there's only one way of understanding at-one-ment, and it requires a very harsh idea of God with much judgment, punishment, and hell. But we should always remember that Christians have never had one way of understanding atonement, and that the oldest ways do not focus on blood or guilt satisfaction. Instead, a helpful way into atonement is vividly expressed by the wonderful Chinese artist and professor He Chi. Look at his crucifixion picture, used with his permission on the front of our liturgy sheet today. What strikes you about it? Do you see perhaps how the crucified Christ is immersed in those from the margins? Who do you see there? With whom do you connect? Who challenges you? Is it the prisoner behind bars, the person with AIDS, the poor man lying on the pavement, the parent mourning her dead child? Or maybe, like some, you're challenged by the naked woman clinging to Christ. Significantly and sadly, in a way, this has been seen as the most controversial aspect of the picture, as if women's nakedness had nothing to do with God, or because our society, even in exploiting it, thinks that women's nakedness is less shocking than a prisoner behind bars, a person with AIDS, or the poor and homeless on our city streets. But the point of the picture is surely that God and atonement is in all these people and more. He Chi is affirming that atonement is about becoming one with all, especially those on the margins. So just as the Spirit of God, that white dove in the picture, is present in all of God's creation, so the Spirit is present in the crucifixion, in all of redemption, and in the new creation, uniting God with all who suffer and are marginalized. So atonement then is about God's solidarity with all of God's creation, especially the suffering, not so much punishment as liberation. Because in our gospel story today, if there's judgment present, surely it's of the powerful who condemned Christ to suffering, either actively or like Pilate washed their hands of compassion. And Jesus' words are very powerful, aren't they? Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. Yes, the unjust suffering of individuals like that of Jesus may tear our hearts, but Jesus is saying, do not dwell on my death alone, except as it reveals the powers of fear and hate and the structures of sin and oppression. For if Good Friday is truly to be good, to be salvific, healing, and bring new life and freedom, we must hear Jesus' larger message. Who and where are people being crucified in our nation today? And what can we learn from what is happening and what else it threatens?
Two others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified Jesus with the criminals, one on his right, one on his left. One of the criminals who was hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Well, save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he replied, "Truly today you will be with me in paradise."
On a theme from Julian's chapter 20. "6 hours outstretched in the sun, yes, hot wood, the nails, blood trickling into the eyes, yes. But the thieves on their neighbour crosses survived till after the soldiers had come to fracture their legs, or longer. Why single out the agony? What's a mere 6 hours? Torture then, torture now. The same. The pain's the same. Immemorial branding iron, electric prod. Hasn't a child, dazed in the hospital ward they reserve for the most abused, known worse? The air we're breathing, these very clouds, ephemeral billows languid upon the sky's moody oceans, we share with women and men who've held out days and weeks on the rack. And in the ancient dust of the world, what particles of the long tormented, what ashes. But Julian's lucid spirit leapt to the difference, perceived why no oar could measure that brief day's endless length, why among all the tortured, one only is king of grief. The wanting she saw, the wanting with the Godhead, opened him utterly to the pain of all minds, all bodies, sands of the sea, of the desert, from first beginning to last day. The great wonder is that the human cells of his flesh and bone didn't explode when utmost imagination rose in that flood of knowledge. Unique, in agony. Infinite strength, incarnate, empowered him to endure inside of history through those hours when he took to himself the sum total of anguish and drank even the lees of that cup. Within the mesh of the web, himself woven into it, yet seeing it whole. Every sorrow and desolation he saw and sorrowed in kinship.
Another way into atonement which may help us is therefore that of the medieval mystic Julian of Norwich. Creatively expressed in Denise Levertov's poem, Julian here rightly protests our obsession sometimes with the suffering and death of Jesus alone. But equally rightly, as a Christian, she affirms the importance of this particular death, not because it concerns settling a debt to God, but because it reveals God anew, caught up in the transformation of the suffering of all. Because God's no bystander here, nor is God simply understanding. Rather, God is in the very midst of suffering. And so, what we mark today is an awesome revelation of divine love, not about personal salvation alone, but cosmic in its dimensions and all-encompassing. Yes, certainly, our hearts, lives, bodies, and world are torn apart today, but God in Christ is among us. For he, she, they have become one with us. They are at one with us in suffering and death, and in the power of this at-oneing love will prevail.
It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. And Jesus, crying out in a loud voice, said, "Abba, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he said, "Certainly, this man was innocent." And all the crowds who had gathered for this spectacle saw what had taken place, and they returned home, beating their breasts. But all of Jesus' acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things.
My God, why have you forsaken me?
Why are you so far from helping me?
Oh my God, I howl in the daytime.
But
You do not hear me.
I groan in the watches of the night.
but
I find no rest.
You are my midwife, O God.
drawing
Me out of the womb.
I was weak and unknowing,
yet
You were my hope.
even as I lay close to the breast.
Cast upon you from the days of my birth.
My strength drains away like water.
bones are out of joint.
My heart also in the midst of my body is even like melting wax. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd.
My tongue cleaves to my gums.
My hands and my feet are withered.
Lay me down in the dust of death.
The fifth tearing of the heart of ourselves. Today is the first time I've worn this dress since my parents' funeral last year. It was a hard time for a while even to glimpse it again in the closet. For like other garments and fragments of our intimate lives, some things are tough enough to recognise, never mind even hold gently and move through. So what fragments of your torn heart, I wonder, do you bring? T.S. Eliot's words spoke from my torn heart last December as I went to England, as Omicron flared up vigorously in Britain, as I accompanied my parents in their deaths just hours apart, as I stumbled through the repercussions and the funeral, as I tried to let go of the home, the places, the people, the memories which had been there for me, even when so far away for over 50 years. A cold coming we had of it, just the worst time of year for a journey, and such a long journey, the ways deep and the weather sharp, the very dead of winter. But doesn't T.S. Eliot speak for us all, at least metaphorically, in all our journeys through grief, loss, suffering and death, when he speaks of that journey of the Magi? And I know there are several of us here who know the pain of suffering, of death, and of grief, some of it very, very recent and immediate and very raw. For the journey of suffering is truly a cold, hard, deep and wintry one. And that's part of what we face today as we remember the seeming death of love itself. And we can't simply leap out of suffering or death. We can't just flick a switch and usher in Easter. Rather, only through our own Good Fridays, our own winters, our own wounds, will we experience grace anew. But we will. I know Good Friday is hard for many of us. Christians do not always help us when we dwell too much on suffering and death, for they are very real, like the darker colours of my dress. Yet they are not the end. Good Friday is good. For our story is not ended, there is hope, for love has not been ended. It actually has triumphed. It is a victory because it has seen things through to the last. Love, as we shall just hear in a moment from the poet-priest Malcolm Gwilt, does not leave us even when we are so sorely pressed or feel utterly forsaken. The rhythms and rituals we use to bear our suffering, grief and death are, as he says, often beautiful, useless gestures of relief. And yet, love is still there. And as the poet puts it, the love that's poured out in silence at graves or renews flowers, tends the bare earth. Well, it is never lost. Never lost. Do we fear to believe it or trust it? In suffering and in death, we are never alone, however absent or far away love feels. For in Malcolm Gwilt's words, in Christ, in the depths of suffering and death, all love is found and sown with him as a seed in the rich ground. For there is blue as well as dark in my dress, just as there is gold on this black stole as well as the dark. And so in Good Friday, crucifixion, yes, but also the hint of resurrection. For we should sorrow and grieve today and at other moments in our lives, for ourselves and others and creation as a whole. But let us trust that love will never be defeated, and that knowing this, we also will never ultimately be forsaken in the loving power of the cross of Jesus. Amen.
at the centre. Here at the centre, everything is still before the stir and movement of our grief, which bears its pain with rhythm, ritual, beauty, beautiful useless gestures of relief. So they anoint the skin that cannot feel, soothing his ruined flesh with tender care, kissing the wounds they know will not heal, with incense scenting only empty air. He blesses every love that weeps and grieves and makes our grief the pangs of a new birth. The love that's poured in silence at old graves, renewing flowers, tending the bare earth, is never lost. In him all love is found and sown with him, a seed in the rich ground.